Sorry, Nikki. Where's Nikki? There's Nikki. I'm sorry I made you wait. This was my miscalculation here. But this sounds absolutely fascinating. Nikki Munitz is a self-esteem development counselor and coach. Who of us do not need some coaching in self-esteem? So, an addiction specialist and the founder and director of Nikki Munitz and Associates. She says she's a global authority on self-esteem development and addiction recovery and helps people break free of the prison of a negative belief system. What a wonderful way to go to lunch. Thank you, Nikki. The mic's not on? No, they must do it there.
Thank you. Oh, I'm on. I have to say I'm going to manage my nerves because when I introduce myself in a minute, you'll understand why. So I'm going to start by saying my name's Nikki Munitz and I am a mother and a wife and a coach and an author and a trainer and a speaker. But if I really identify myself properly, I'm prisoner number 914-23067. I'm a fraudster. So I'm really excited to be here with all of you and to give you a different perspective as well. But all the other labels that I carry of being privileged and middle class, and when I grew up, I was popular and athletic and I was academic, and then I became an addict and a criminal. And that was the story that kind of took me down this road, which lands me up at the Fraud Summit. So that's really, really interesting for me to be here and to listen to the other side, the other perspective. And the best part of this whole process of me learning who I was and who I am, getting rid of all those other labels that I carried with me, is that my book now, my name sits on a book and I'm no longer nameless. I have a title and a label, and it carries with me everywhere that I go. The experience that I had of being processed in prison, I got to go through it twice, which I'll explain in more detail. But I think it's really helpful if I actually set the tone of what took me down that road in the first place. I grew up absolutely privileged in a private school. Nothing really untoward in my childhood, except that I was the youngest of 4 children. And I've got 3 older brothers. My father died when I was 10, and my mother was left with 4 children, all under the age of 18. And I think for someone who was probably ill-equipped to begin with, becoming a mother under those circumstances and that kind of stress level, she really left me to my own devices. And I think considering that was the case, I actually landed up doing really well. And I excelled at school and I had a really great time, and there were no issues that arose. In fact, I'd consider myself quite a good girl. And as I went through my schooling career and lived through this experience at home of being this youngest child, my mother was quite tired by the time she got to me and raising me. My eldest brother is an addict, and so all of her energy was quite tied up into him, and so my energy was into excelling. So I really wanted her attention, and I thought that the way that I would get that is by doing really well. And for the most part that worked, until it didn't, and my brother took over all of the attention. And so I just thought, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And so I followed suit. It's pretty normal for teenagers to be experimenting. I really believed, I think like most people who go down the road of addiction, that that would never, ever happen to me. You know, those are stupid people. They don't know what they're doing. You know, they get caught in the grips of that. I was just having fun with my friends and I was having a great experience, and there was nothing really untoward in that process for me, but rather I got gripped in a cycle that I landed up having very little control over. And so now, in hindsight, as I describe myself as a self-esteem expert, I now understand that the real cause of my struggle was not anything from the experience that I had in life, but really that I had zero coping skills on how to manage my life effectively. So I gripped onto what I thought that I needed, which was friends, which was socializing, which was peer pressure, which was trying to fit in. And I suppose stand out in that way because I so desperately wanted to be seen. And of course, if you are misbehaving, you certainly are noticed. So I went through school. There was nothing really exciting in school. If I look back at pictures, I did a workshop the other day, an inner child workshop, and we had to find a picture from school that really kind of depicted where we were at. And so I found this picture, and I had colors in just about every sport down my blazer. I would probably have been voted least likely to go down the wrong road. But on the inside, I was absolutely devastated, and I had no way of expressing that to anybody. When matric ended, it was like this explosion. I was finally free. I didn't have to pretend to be the good girl anymore, and I really went wild. And so although I went to university, in the old days at Rand Afrikaans University, there was a pub on campus that opened at 11. And so any lecture after 11, but I was at university every day. And eventually I got introduced to various substances along the way, and they really took hold because they gave me some element of comfort and confidence that I had craved in my life, and I just really had no idea how to get. And so I embarked on this love affair. And really, that's the best way that I can describe it, because no one lands up taking drugs or abusing alcohol because it's crappy. We do it because it feels really good, and that's what grips you. And so I landed up doing first year at university twice. Eventually, they asked me to leave because I wasn't coping. And during that period, I really started to kind of lose the plot to a large extent. And during that time, because my mother was so wise to the addiction elements because of my brother, she caught on quite quickly that there was a serious problem. And so she tried various ways to help me get my life together. One of the ways was that she sent me to Australia to visit my brother, my youngest brother who had immigrated. And the drug of choice that I had picked in the end was heroin. Of course, what you see in the movies versus what it's like in real life is not quite the same thing. So, I thought that what I had been told about it wasn't true. So it was something that I was willing to try. And the hold took a grip on me quite quickly. And I left here. I flew via Malaysia. The drug laws in Malaysia are very strict, and so I was terrified. So I left here and I was in withdrawal and I was really sick, and I arrived in Australia, and it took me the sum total of an hour to find, I suppose, the Hillbrow equivalent, which is King's Cross. And I used the whole time while I was in Australia and returned back to South Africa in exactly the same condition as I had left. So that plan was foiled. It did not work. And then it didn't take very long. When your drug addict friends don't want to hang out with you anymore, then you're in some serious trouble. So I decided to go to my mother and ask her for some help because, the people around me were starting to say, this is really problematic. And so I went to her and she said to me, okay, we're going to send you off to a treatment center. There's some really good ones. I'm not going to send you to one in Johannesburg because I think you'll run away if I do. So I'm going to send you off to Cape Town, and you're going to go to treatment there. You'll do 3 weeks. The insurance companies pay for 3 weeks, and then you can come home. So I thought, okay, that's wonderful. So I went off to treatment, and I turned 18 there. And on my 18th birthday, my mother said to me, you're not coming home. You need to stay, long-term treatment is the answer. So you're going to stay in Cape Town. You're going to go into the next step of treatment. And when you're ready, you can come back. Although I thought I knew everything, like most 18-year-olds do, I certainly didn't. And so part of the journey was that I eventually got kicked out of treatment for breaking all of the rules. I was no longer the good girl anymore. In fact, I was asked to leave treatment with the word saying, you are constitutionally incapable of being honest, was the description. although I did know that I got introduced to some lifestyle that I knew would be quite pivotal in my life going forward, I certainly wasn't ready to pay much attention yet. And so I phoned my mother and I said, I need to come back to Johannesburg. This isn't working. And she said, well, you're not coming back to Johannesburg. You've made your bed. You have to lie in it and you're going to stay in Cape Town. I did. And I had made friends. I'd been there for 6 months already. And some other mother who felt terribly sorry for me took me in and like really tried to nurture me. But at that point, I was already back on the drugs and was stealing from her in order to support my habit. I was waitressing at the time, and eventually got fired from my waitressing job because I weighed 37 kilograms and the manager told me I couldn't serve food to people looking the way that I did. So I was really, really ill at the time. And so I had made friends within the drug community, and I was living in a backpackers in Observatory in Cape Town, and we lived next to the YMCA. And I used to often phone my mother from the YMCA, when I needed to just tell her, this is proof of life. I'm still alive. It's okay. Can I have some money, please? And I used to catch the train with the caretaker from the YMCA. And this caretaker, he was a bit, a little slow, but really like kind and always checked in on how I was doing. And when things got really bad, my mother got a message from someone in Cape Town just to say that I really wasn't doing well. And she needed to get to Cape Town quite urgently or I wasn't going to make it. And she didn't know where I lived, but she had heard me call from the YMCA. And she went to the YMCA and she found this caretaker. And he said to her, are you looking for the white Jewish girl? And he showed her where I was living. And at that point, my mother walked in. There was a knock on the door. I had sold everything. I had a mattress on the floor. My drug dealer was in the room with me. My mother had bought me a necklace for my 18th birthday. And he was wearing it because I had given it to him because I had nothing else. And my mother, who is quite terrifying at the best of times, walked in and she said to him, you take that necklace off right now. And he just cracked himself and he did it and off he went. And I tried to explain to people, like, that's the kind of power that my mother had. And it was often quite scary to me. And that's usually why I didn't ask for help, because I was too afraid of what the consequences were going to be. And so after my mother found me and she took me to a hotel for the weekend and she said, right, you really need to clean up because you're really not doing well and I can't leave you here like this. And I said, that's amazing. I know this beautiful rehab in Plettenberg Bay. And she said to me, no, your time at the beach is over, dear. We're not going to do that again. So she decided to send me to a treatment center in the Karoo. The agreement was that I would go for a year or I wasn't allowed to come home. For any of you that know anything about treatment centers, this rehabilitation center in the middle of the Karoo is boot camp. There is nothing luxurious about it. We looked after pit bulls. We ate donated food that was expired. And it was probably one of the happiest times of my life, even though it was really abusive, if I look back in hindsight. And the reason it was the happiest time in my life is because I was free. I didn't have to worry about where the next hit was coming from, where my next money was going to come from. I had a bed to sleep in. I had 3 meals a day. I had food to eat, and there were dogs, which made me happy. And so I stayed, and it was really, really challenging. And I turned 21 in this facility. And when it came to around the 11-month mark, what had happened during that period while I was there had been quite a traumatic incident that had happened at the treatment center where a young boy had died, and a lot of people had left the treatment center. One of those people was then going to be my future husband at that point in time. And so when he returned, he left and he came back because he had relapsed. And because this young boy had died, they changed the way the treatment center was run, and they actually put myself, all of 21, and my husband, well, he wasn't my husband then, my boyfriend, in charge of the detox house, and he was 22. They put us two children kind of running, because we'd been to rehab before, they thought we'd kind of had some idea on how to do things. Anyway, we were, needless to say, more interested in one another than we were in anything else, and spent a lot of the time getting to know each other. And for me, the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's kind of partly where my fraud journey really began. I mean, aside from the fact that I never felt whole or fulfilled up until that point, he's now my ex-husband. His parents had dropped him off at the rehab in a Rolls Royce. And one of the messages that he had written to me was that when we get married, I want to fight with you over the credit card bill. And I was like, sold. I'm in, you know. And I bought into this whole fantasy. The part that he didn't tell me was that the family that he came from was not quite kosher. I had no idea. And I really was so determined to have a family and to like get that love and acceptance and connection that I so deeply desired, that I bought in hook, line, and sinker. And eventually, just before I'd been there for a year, there was another incident. Mother eventually let me leave and to come home. And I came back to Johannesburg. And shortly after that, I moved in with my boyfriend and his family. And during that period, because this treatment center where we'd come from was really Christian, my ex-husband had decided he wanted to study to be a pastor. And he also decided that we could no longer live together in sin. And so we got married. That was basically his marriage proposal. You know, let's break up or get married. And I was like, I'm in. You know, this is it. And I got really intertwined with a family that I didn't understand at the time. And that's not to take away any of the responsibility that I hold and take for the crimes that I committed. But I certainly was completely uneducated and quite naive when it comes to what I witnessed. When other children at 16 years old were getting pocket money, what I learned along the way was that my ex-husband was getting a packet of Mandrax and ecstasy and told to sell that as his pocket money. And I really didn't quite, you know, for me it was, oh, you know, the bad boy. I mean, the ultimate bad boy. And we lived in Waterkloof in Pretoria, and I really got sold this like life. And so when it came down to the eventuality of me having access to the attorney that I worked for's trust account, it was a no-brainer in the end. When my life was threatened, not in a physical sense, but, you know, there was no money. And I came up with what I thought was a short-term solution. And the plan was to put the money back. That was always the plan. You know, like what Hendrik was saying, I had no idea what the actual consequences were. When I eventually got charged with racketeering, I didn't even know what that was. I had no clue. And so we lived this lifestyle, and I really tried to step up to the plate. We got married. I had 2 children. And all of the while, I'd say that was all part of my fraud as well, because I'd explained to people that for me, that was like playing house, because I certainly didn't know how to be a wife or a mother. I barely knew how to be a functional adult. And I was clean and sober at the time, and I got given a great opportunity when I was pregnant with my daughter, my first child, to step in as a receptionist for a short period of time at this law firm. And while I was there, I built a really good relationship with the boss, and he thought that I had real potential. And so he offered me a full-time position to train as a legal secretary and a conveyancing secretary after I had my child and I returned back to work. And I did that, and I absolutely excelled. And I loved my job, and I really loved my boss. And that was probably one of the biggest regrets that I had in the whole experience of the crime. In that, like what Hendrik was saying, I was like, I'd really like to keep my job, even though I committed this crime. But more detail about the crime itself. I'm going to read you an excerpt from the book, if I can. It's just another quiet afternoon in the office when it dawns on me there might be a temporary solution to my problems. Through a simple sign-off from our accounts manager, I have access to the personal trust account set up by Schwellness Incorporated on behalf of our clients. It would be easy to request the transfer of a few £1,000 without anyone noticing. This could be a temporary lifeline, as the money could cover my bond for the month, just trying to get me out of my mess with the bank. They're trying to take our home. What will happen to us if we don't have anywhere to stay? I take a deep breath. I doctor a transfer request to be approved by the bookkeeper. Adding a zero to the amount is easy. I wait, I hold my breath, and it gets signed off. The payment is successful. That was so easy. I exhale. I can breathe again, although my heart is beating wildly. Surely it can't be as simple as this. I wait a few days to be discovered, and nothing. No one sees, no one checks, no one even notices. Now there's no turning back. To give some perspective, I was charged with 37 counts of fraud that went on for a period of 6 months before I was caught. And when I first got caught, my thinking was like, why did you take so long? Like, why did you let me get away with it for so long? And the reality is, I had no intention of carrying that on, and I was quite relieved to be caught. And the experience for me in the process was that, so the crime took place in 2007. I was caught out 6 months after I started, and I was only arrested for the first time in 2009. I had been under investigation for a year and I had no idea. And during that period, I had relapsed. I had 8 years clean. I then relapsed and I then cleaned up again. And I was 3 months clean when I got arrested and had 2 little children in tow. My son was 18 months old. My ex-husband now, him and his father were both charged in the crime with me because I was taking money and giving it to them. Although I was the first accused, I was the one who took the full brunt. And I'm so grateful today that that happened to me. So the process of what happened when I went to, through this whole process is that my lawyers, with their best intention, explained to me that as a single mother, first-time offender, there would be no jail time involved. So needless to say, I was quite shocked when I got sentenced to 8 years in prison. And I kind of just remember standing in the dock when that happened and all the blood draining from me, because I had no idea that that was going to be the case. And I couldn't accept it. So I got sentenced in 2011 and we appealed the matter and went back to court, to High Court in 2014, where I lost my appeal. And I think I'm sharing this with you because obviously there's a human aspect of the fraud that we talk about, the fraudsters. Obviously, some people are really just driven by crime. Other people are driven by desperation. And I'd like to believe that I was driven by desperation. Anyway, that's maybe just my own conscience. And when I lost my appeal, the way that it works is that they give you a month to get your affairs in order before you hand yourself in, which is the most bizarre experience in the world, because it's like you've got this sword of Damocles hanging over your head. In this time also, I had got a job. As I said, I was 8 years clean. I had 2 children, and I had actually become the head counselor at one of the most prestigious treatment centers in South Africa during the time. And I didn't know when to tell my children. At this point in time, my son was 6 and my daughter was 8. And having to tell them was probably more difficult than going to prison itself. And so I told them the night before so that their little minds didn't have to worry about it for the whole month the way that I had to. And they had the most innocent little questions, like, but if you did something wrong, why are you being punished for it now if it was so long ago? And I had to explain to them that there are consequences for our actions. And I'm really glad I got to have that conversation with them. And I also had to explain to them that the next day when they went to school, when they came home from school, I wouldn't be there. And I went and I handed myself in and I started serving my sentence. And, I started this part by saying that the experience of losing my identity in prison is what really made me find myself. Because when you arrive at the prison, you are progressively stripped of who you are. From the clothes that you're wearing, you get a uniform. Men wear orange, women wear blue. It says prisoner, prisoner, prisoner all over. You no longer have a name, you have a number. Your fingerprints are taken. Your mugshot is taken. And your life as you knew it no longer exists. And I say I went through that twice because my legal team continued to fight while I was in prison. And they landed up getting an opportunity to go to the Supreme Court. And I got bail again. So I was in prison for 2.5 months. I came out on bail again, and they eventually reduced my sentence through the Supreme Court to a 3-year 2761I, which means that I needed to serve 1/6 of my sentence in the prison and the rest under house arrest. The conundrum was that I needed to tell my children all over again that I was going back to prison. This time I decided to tell them the week before as opposed to the night before, so that they had time to really comprehend it and to make sense of it themselves, and that it wasn't such a massive shock to them. Obviously, I knew what to expect this time round, and I went to prison, and something happened for me in prison. Like I said, I worked for this incredible rehabilitation center. I earned a great salary. They paid my legal fees. They even paid my salary while I was in prison. But something happened for me there. I realized that I didn't know who I was and that I was so desperately seeking other people's affirmation and acknowledgement that I was willing to steal for it. And I did a course on self-esteem while I was in prison that changed how I operate in the world and how I see the world and how I interact. And so I came out of prison with a very different mindset and with this belief that, we can come up with all of these ideas on how to deal with the fraudsters if we're not dealing with the systemic issues of both the fraudsters and the people working at these entities. We're going to be fighting against a system that is never ending. And so I decided that I really owed something to my employer because they had supported me so incredibly while I was in prison. But I decided that I was an 18-month cutoff period because I wanted to do things differently. I wanted to offer people something different. And so I came out and I learned more about what self-esteem really was and the impact that it had actually had in my life. And I made it a mission to learn as much as I could about it so that I could teach this. And I do this around the world now. And it's just mad. I'm like, I came here when I got invited to speak here. I thought, what could I teach a bunch of experts around fraud? And then I thought, well, I could teach you how to not be a fraud. That's what I could teach you. Because everybody sitting in this room comes here with their own set of labels, right? Think about it. Your job description, whether you're a husband or a wife or a mother, and what those labels mean to you. It's how you identify yourself. It creates shame for us if we don't feel like we're living up to it effectively. I work with mostly the upper echelon of society who feel absolutely shattered as human beings, but what you see is not that at all. And I came here today thinking, you know, how could this be of value to people that are sitting in this room? And let me tell you, listening to that last session was really valuable to me, because I'm one of those people, even though I'm not that, I'm terrified of someone who calls me, you know, on the, I'll rather go into a branch and deal with something myself. I will never have a conversation. If someone asks me for my ID number, I'm like, no. And maybe that's also just the trauma from being with a bunch of criminals in prison, because the reality is prison isn't a deterrent. In fact, it probably feeds crime, as we know. And the law seems to be unfairly biased towards certain individuals and not to others. And I don't think that that's the way that we're going to get the solutions that we're looking for. And I was just, you know, really thinking about having fought so long and so hard in my life to really be seen and accepted, that it landed me in a position where I was absolutely stripped of my identity, almost erased. You know, as you're going through this process, if you can just imagine, the lights are really bright and you walk through, and you know, there's a whole bunch of people that are being processed for various different crimes. No one's talking. No one's asking questions. No one's giving guidance. No one's asking, why did you do this? What help did you actually need? Right? We all talk about the punishment of, and of course there needs to be consequence. And I'm really glad that I feel like I did pay my dues in the end. But it's still not easy. I mean, someone sent me, a client paid me from overseas through Bidvest Bank. And I'm flagged as a fraudster with a criminal record. That was really humiliating. I still have to deal with those things, you know. Although I have been privileged to leave the country, it's a dance that I have to do in order to be able to get permission to travel out of the country. And I'm almost 15 years clean. You know, this is a long period where this has been kind of traveling behind me. And what I explain to people is that the worst part of this whole experience was not the fact that I went to prison, but my whole life was a prison. And I think that when we live with things like imposter syndrome and those types of false beliefs about ourselves, that is a prison in itself. And so I'm grateful that I get to really spend each and every day of my life helping people break free of that prison, because you don't have to be in a physical prison to feel that way. And even if you are really successful in your life, there are still elements that would land up holding you back. Most of it's in your head through our programming, the way that we see ourselves, the way that we see life. And a few tweaks and a few changes can really make such a massive difference in the way that we are able to function. Because it's important that we sit here successfully outwardly, but to feel that on the inside too. The funny part of me, I got so stripped of my identity when I was in prison that even on the day that I was leaving, my clothes, because they've got a room where they keep your clothes, your personal clothes, which they give back to you. You know, you give them the uniform back and then you get your clothes back. My clothes had been stolen. I was like, oh, God has got a great sense of humor. He wants me to take nothing, nothing from my old life with me. I'm walking out of here completely like clean. If you each take a moment and think about your own experiences of feeling like a fraud at times with that imposter syndrome. I know for me, it's a huge part of the reason why I committed that crime in the first place. That wanting to belong, wanting to be accepted What's the role that that has played in your life? What's the drive? Because for me, figuring that out was in essence learning that I held the key to the prison the whole time. And we live thinking someone else or something else is going to let us out. My story is one of being a mother and a wife and a daughter and a sister. It's one of loss and of grief and of trauma and of theft and of desperation, but it's also one of hope and change and growth. And these things aren't unique to me. They're human. They're for all of us. You know? And I think, one of the guys was saying, we get so excited when you catch a criminal, like, I got you. What if you got excited about more than that? What if you got excited about your life and about who you were and who you are? Because for me, growing up in the privileged school that I did, I would have actually imagined myself speaking at the Fraud Summit as an academic, not as a case study. I would have been voted probably least likely to have committed a crime, but yet here I am speaking to you from my experience. And an experience that has had such a deep and profound, meaningful impact on my life that it's given me purpose. What I can teach a room full of experts in fraud is about self-acceptance and about authenticity as the keys to our self-imposed prisons. And that learning to truly love ourselves and not reject ourselves based on the labels that we carry, on the opinions of others, the expectations of others, the hope that someone else is going to accept us, that someone else is going to see us. And to really own those labels like a boss, like they're your own, not because someone else gave them to you or you're trying to live up to them. Because that's what we do. We hide behind them, all of these labels. When I was in prison, I didn't complete my degree when I was in prison. I'd completed it just before I landed up going in. And I was very lucky to come out of prison in time for my graduation. I was so excited. But I often think to myself, what did I need that for? All the letters behind my name. None of that stuff helped me. The being popular at school, having colors, being really sporty and academic, none of that helped me. What did help me is learning that I'm a really valuable and worthwhile human being, and I bring a lot to the table, and that I get the privilege of teaching other people to do exactly the same in their own lives. And not only that, and I'm really glad that being, someone with a criminal record, I'm not held back completely because I have businesses. I've really, the difference that I make is that I currently have 2 rehabilitation centers, one in Cape Town and one here in Johannesburg, and a coaching institute so that I can train people to do what I do and to make a difference in other people's lives. And often facilitate work reintegration for people that have struggled with addiction. Some of the entities that are here are actually really supportive of those with, the EAP programs. It's amazing because people make mistakes. And, it's easy to see the crime and the criminal as something not human, one step removed from us. But I'm hoping that today I'm showing you the human side of this, that we can at least approach with some compassion. Because I think compassion is what makes us human, that we can really engage with the work that we do with a full picture, Because as much as all the entities, insurance companies and banks want to collaborate together to be able to stop fraud and to stop crime, for me, it's a far more holistic picture. We all need to be working together. Right? If we're not doing the work with our communities, with our employees, with our families, with our friends, crime is going nowhere. It's here to stay. And I mean, I think that's great because Fraud Summit happens, I'm assuming, every year, right? And you guys will always have things to talk about. But I'm sure there also needs to be some victories. So I'd like you each to take a minute and think about some of your strengths. Some of the strengths that make you who you are. Things like kindness, things like generosity, maybe a good sense of humor, maybe being courageous. Most of you will notice that you may have a gremlin that lives in your head. That gremlin, every time you pop up and say something nice about yourself, will try and stop you and say to you, you're not kind. You know, this morning when you were driving here to Indaba Hotel, you passed about 25 beggars and you shooed them all away from your car. That's not very kind, is it? That gremlin is very well trained and very well programmed because it was programmed by you. So it knows you very well. You are humans and not robots, and no one is anything all of the time, which means if you are like me, I left my house at 5 o'clock this morning in Cape Town to get here. There was no time to stop and be kind. There was a mission. That doesn't mean that I'm not a kind person. It means today I was in a rush. I have kindness in my toolbox with me 24/7, and I can choose whether to pull it out of my toolbox or not. And especially for those of you working in corporate. How much of yourselves do you really get to bring to work? What would change if you did? If you walked into a meeting with a colleague that irritates the living daylights out of you, but before you walked in and you said, I'm kind, I'm compassionate, I'm a good listener, I'm ready for this. How would that be? Would it make a difference in the discussion that you landed up having? What if you thought about how creative you were when you were coming up with solutions on how to deal with crime and fraud? We are not taught to say nice things about ourselves. In fact, we're taught quite the opposite. It's a massive problem. For those of you who don't know, each and every one of you are priceless, unique individuals. If you have ever encountered an object that is unique, it's priceless. You cannot put a value on it. That is you, each and every one of you. Yet we spend our days, I want to be thin like that one. I want to look like that one. I want to live like that one. Why? This is an opportunity for you to be the magical you that you are, to know that there isn't another one of you in the whole entire universe. So I'm going to end this by saying that you really don't need to go to prison to rid yourself of the need of other people's acceptance. All you need to do is own your own story. And all of these strengths can form part of the labels that you now carry around with you, on top of your CEO or director or whatever it is that you have as part of your job description. And you get to own the story instead of letting the story dictate you. You are the main character in your own story. You do not need to live like you're playing a supporting role anymore. So I am going to finish a bit early because I thought I would leave some time for questions if anyone had any or thoughts. If anyone's feeling super brave and shares something like a strength of their own, I would really love to hear that.
Thank you so much, Nikki. It's enormous vulnerability. There, please. Oh, I'm in the.
Thank you firstly for sharing your story in a room with a bunch of fraud investigators. Must be extremely challenging to stand up there and tell your story. Can you perhaps just take us back to how the fraud was committed, just the process of what you did?
Sure.
Specifically to get the money from the trust accounts to you.
Sure. So I was essentially a conveyancing secretary, and I had access to the lawyer's trust account by putting in requisitions of payments that needed to be made. I don't know their back end story of whatever lack of checks and balances that they had in place. But I'll give credit to a bank. It was ABSA that eventually flagged it. Good job, ABSA. That after 6 months, eventually after, I don't know exactly the back end story, but it was, I think it was probably more than 37 counts. I'm not totally sure, but I was eventually charged with 37 counts. So it was different requisitions that I had put in, and they would just kind of make the payments all the time. So if you sold your house, that money would come into the trust account, which I'm sure you will, and then I was just kind of, I was spending other people's money. I mean, it was, at the time, I didn't kind of think the whole story, and I really had intention of putting that money back. But my ex-father-in-law had really got himself into a financial bind, and when he caught wind of what I was doing, he happily jumped on the bandwagon and was putting in requisitions left, right, and well, to me, requisitions, which I was then just actioning. Yeah.
Clear enough. Over there, please.
Very interesting story. Thank you for that. I wanted to know, what was the deciding factor? What actually drove you to make the decision to commit the crime? Did you try to solve it before that, or was it just something that said, hey, you know what, this is the easiest solution, let me go there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Yes, I tried desperately. So what had happened, my ex-husband worked for his father in their family business. And because they were in financial trouble, it meant that we were all in financial trouble. So my house was about to be sold on auction. And I tried desperately to get credit cards with all the big banks, of which I was declined. And I don't know exactly how the idea came to me, but I really thought it would just be a once off. And when my ex-father-in-law, the company was, their biggest customer was kind of having a financial audit. So all like holds were put on the accounts. And I thought when they started paying again, I would just put that money back in. It just didn't obviously work out that way. Yeah.
Ruda, there's a hand raised on the online.
Oh, okay. Please, the online questioner.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zelani from ABSA Bank. Nikki, first of all, thank you so much for your courage and your bravery standing before us today, and sharing, your vulnerabilities with, strangers, especially fraud combat strangers. Thank you so much. I really commend you for that, and I'm raising applause for you on the online audience. I've been employed with ABSA now, previously forensic investigator, and part of my work was to, interview, fraud suspects who are staff members. I'll sit in an empty room with them, I'll get the truth out of them. And the first prize for a forensic investigator is to pull a confession out of the perpetrator. And you'll be so surprised. So many of them will say to me, Zelani, honestly, I'm just relieved that you guys finally caught me, because I was really exhausted, right? That's the half of them. Of course, the other half just look at you like a proper gangster and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I want to know something. Is the fear of prison a deterrent for a fraud suspect, especially given your background? Like, for example, you said verbatim that you are from a privileged background. I'm talking about bankers, you know, whose daily lives are coming into this huge building, warm coffee, warm chair, heels, you know, that type of lifestyle, and knowing what a prison looks like, or even if you don't know from television, is that fear not a big enough deterrent for someone like you to say, I'm definitely not going to do this because I don't want to be, I'm so afraid of prison, I'm just not going to do it? Is that a deterrent?
Unfortunately, denial is not a river in Egypt. And I think every single person believes that that's never going to happen to them. You know, I really never in a million years thought I would ever land up in prison. And obviously having a history in addiction, I did other things that were illegal and never kind of got caught for it, as many people that are addicts do. And so I really didn't think that that would ever happen. So I don't think it's a deterrent. Plus, obviously, we live in a country where we think people don't get punished for their crimes. So I think that also plays a role. You know, what I've learned now is that you're more likely to go to prison for white collar crime than for murder. I know that today, but I don't think a lot of people actually know that. Yeah. And I had that very same experience of that absolute relief. In fact, one of the attorneys that I worked with at the time testified in my trial, where she heard me on the phone with my ex saying to him, please, I don't want to do this anymore. And him saying to me, just one more time, just one more time. So that was evidence in my matter as well. So yeah, it was just relief.
Nikki, hi. As you know, it's Lynette Swanepoel from SAFPS. Who took care of your children and how have they recovered from the trauma of all of this?
I can't even tell you how, you know, I think because I had turned my life around in the interim while I was fighting this whole thing, I'd built an incredible support network. So my mother, who isn't, she's not the best mom, but she's always kind of stepped up to the plate when I've needed her. And she was the main caregiver for the children. But you know, when I went to prison the second time, I met my now husband 6 months before I went to jail. And on our first date, I told him, listen, I've got this court case happening. I think I'm going to go to prison. And he was like, no, man, it's going to be fine. And then 6 months later, I went to jail. And he actually landed up moving in with my mom and taking care of the kids. We've been together now not just 9.5 years, I think. And he adopted the kids. They're incredibly well-adjusted, beautiful humans. But it took a lot of work to get there. Yeah.
There's another question there.
Hi, sorry, following on with what you just said about your mom and so forth, what is your relationship, or do you still have a relationship with your ex-husband and his family?
No. So basically what happened was I was first accused, my ex-husband was second accused, my father-in-law was the third. And during the trial process, my ex-father-in-law took me to the bank because I didn't have any cash, I had no income. And he said, I'm going to draw money for you, come meet me at the bank. And when I got to the bank, he pulled out a piece of paper that said I was guilty of the whole crime and they had nothing to do with it. And he said, if you want money to look after yourself and the children, you have to sign this document, which I did. And my lawyer eventually got that thrown out of court, but that was kind of the end of our relationship. Also, my ex-husband, I think he lives under a bridge somewhere. He went completely crazy with drugs, and like I don't actually know where he is. But I was the only one who went to jail. Yeah.
What about your father-in-law?
That's why I say, like,
was he found not enough evidence or what?
He was meant to pay back some of the money through the NPA. He actually sent me a mail a couple of months ago, like ranting and raving because his assets still haven't been released because he hasn't paid the money. But, yeah.
Get them where it hurts. Anyone else? Nikki, thank you again. It was really, you know, as I say, you make yourself vulnerable and you use a hard road to do good. So we really appreciate that. Thank you.